or just enter one line. You want to drink or anything?
I don't think so.
Glass of water?
No, I should be all right. I might just get my charging cord just in case. I'd hope for it to go flat.
You are using the computer audio.
Hello, good morning everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. It's lovely to see a few faces, lots of black squares, but that's okay. So I'm Nicole and I'm one of the directors of Inspired EC, and I'll be doing the training today on seeing the magic in the moment. So we're talking all about programming for babies. So this is generally a session that we would run when we run it in person. It would be a 2-hour session. So it's a really big session. We've jam-packed it into 1 hour. So lots of information brought down into 1 hour, lots of the basics. So I will just get my screen ready to share. So I will be sharing my screen with you today so that you can see all the bits and pieces. Now, just make sure it's all going to cooperate nicely. And there we go. Okay, so let me know if you can't see my screen, but hopefully you've got a lovely picture of my youngest child with a banana phone. And we are good to go. So as I say, I'll keep it moving because we've got a lot to cover. But if at any time you've got any questions, feel free to use the chat box at the bottom. I should get a little notification. I'm hoping it'll still pop up in the bottom even when I'm sharing my screen. Or if not, just unmute yourself and shout it out. All right. I'll just move this over to this side so I can see. All right, so first off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. So we are really fortunate. Where I am right now is in our office, our relatively new office, and we are on beautiful Awabakal land, which we pay respects to our elders past, present and emerging of our Awabakal land. So a couple of things, just some really basic stuff. So unless you're asking a question or you're sharing, if you can keep yourself muted, that would be great. It just stops some of that background noise, depending on where you are. It could be noise of children in the service, it could be dogs barking, it could be the garbage truck, whatever, but it keeps it a little bit quieter for everyone. If you can put your video on, it is greatly appreciated. Just makes it feel like we're not talking to a screen. So it's nice if we can do that, have that human connection as much as possible over the internet. Questions are always welcome. As I said before, just unmute yourself or use the chat box. To temporarily unmute yourself, you can just hold the space bar down while you speak, and then that way it'll automatically go back to muted when you're finished. So that's a really nice handy trick for doing that. All right, so a little bit about me, just a really brief one. That's me and my husband and our 3 children. It was a couple of years ago now, so they're all a lot bigger. They've all gone back to school yesterday, so they're in year 1, year 2 and year 5 this year. So I'm an educator at heart. I'll always be an educator at heart. I've been a director and nominated supervisor, currently an approved provider, trainer, consultant, writing books, all those sorts of bits and pieces. I love to read, write, take photos, be outdoors, and I hate bananas, because you've got to hate something. It's definitely bananas for me. All right. So in terms of what we will cover, I'm just going to try and move that little bit of screen for me. Yep, there we go. So we're going to be looking at a summary of infant development. So just a really brief look at infant development, just because it helps to underpin what we're talking about in terms of programming. We'll talk about what a program for babies can look like, how babies play, and then the real basics of kind of planning, observation and documentation. All right, finish this sentence. Babies are. Now, you might like to type it in the chat box, or you might like to unmute yourself and share, but how would you describe babies or infants? And I will use that term interchangeably. I think babies tends to be a term we're more confident or comfortable with. Infants tends to be a more official term. So whichever term you use, that's okay. But if you'd like to finish the sentence and tell me what babies are. I've got one in the chat box. Capable. Excellent. Babies are indeed very capable. Babies are full of curiosity. Most definitely. Always learning. Dependent. Absolutely. Learning. Sponges. Yes, they can definitely take in whatever else is going on around them. So they tend to absorb a lot of what's happening. Curious to learn. Beautiful. Excellent. So we're all kind of on the same page, confident. We have a high image of infants. So that's a really lovely thing to see. Even the dependent one, yes, they are really dependent on us. And I think it's important that we recognise that. But then depending on the age, as we get to our slightly older infants and they're kind of turning into toddlers, we see that independence really starting to emerge, and it can be a really tricky area going between the two. All right, so babies are lots of things. All right, what is this? The image is a little bit blurry, but what do you think it might be an image? What might it represent? Again, if you want to unmute yourself and share, or you want to comment in the chat box, you're more than welcome. All right, we've got a suggestion in the chat box. Oh, rain on windows. It definitely does. And today here in Newcastle, it is most definitely rain on windows. Very rainy here today. It's not rain on windows, but it could be. I always think it looks like an art piece, like something you'd see in an art gallery. Any other suggestions? Oh, roots that are growing. That's a really interesting one. All right. In fact, it's a representation of the brain, the human brain. Ooh, Oh, splash of art, absolutely. But it's a representation of the human brain. So what we're seeing right over on the far side of the screen is the human brain as a newborn. And so you'll see the human brain as a newborn. There's a few connections, there's a few bits and pieces going on, but ultimately it's just kind of a couple of bits. You know, it's like that's what we're starting with. We're starting with a couple of those bits, and that's because our brains are so new. They've already developed a lot during pregnancy, but ultimately they're so new and everything's kind of building and working on. Then as we move on a little bit, I think this one's about 3 to 4 months, and we start to see already that we've probably at least doubled the number of connections and pathways in the brain. We move on a little bit further and, you know, we've got higher numbers again. This one up here, this the fourth over, so second last one, is actually the toddler brain. And I think that's a really great representation of the toddler brain because there is just so much going on in the toddler brain. And as you can see, you know, some of those pathways have really thickened up. But then the interesting part I find is that the one on the end is the adult brain. Now, what do you notice between kind of the child brain and the adult brain? Oh, I didn't mean to do that. What do you notice between the child brain and the adult brain? Are they different? Are they the same? There you go, in the chat box. Not a lot of difference. Strengthened pathways, absolutely. Thicker stems. Yep, so you'll see that there's probably actually not a lot of difference, but you will notice that there are less pathways. So there are less connections in the brain. The brain has, and there's mixed research about how the brain works in this capacity, but some of the research will suggest that we kind of shed what we don't need and what we don't use, but the things that we do over and over again and the knowledge that we've accrued and all of that sort of stuff will strengthen the brain, the pathways. So that's why we'll see those kind of thicker representations, but less of them because we've gotten rid of the stuff that we don't necessarily need as an adult, but we've really strengthened up the things that we do over and over again, those kind of repetitive things that have really formed strong connections in the brain. So I always just find that really interesting when we're working with infants. You see that difference. So, you know, if this is birth over here and this is 2, the big difference that happens, the growth that happens in the brain between birth and 2 is massive. And I think we all know that working with infants, we know how important that time frame is, but I think it just really highlights that. Okay. Next, we'll go on to a bit of infant development basics. And as I said before, we're not covering everything because there is just way too much to cover. You can kind of go on and on about infant development for an eternity. But we've just covered a few of the basics. So one of the absolute keys that I always refer to when working with any child, but particularly with infants, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I feel like this is something that we often learn in our initial training, but then once we're kind of working with children, it may actually go to the back burner while we kind of, you know, sometimes we get a bit carried away with newer research or something that's a bit more interesting or appealing. But for me, I think when we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and looking at meeting those basic needs before anything else, we're doing a much better service to children. So, you know, we're kind of starting at those really basic needs for children. If we don't meet those absolute basic needs, you know, love and belonging and safety and, you know, food and water and shelter and all those kinds of really basic things, if we don't meet that, then those kind of, you know, the learning things, I suppose, or the educational things that we sort of, I think, expect to see in our programs, those things can't happen. So we really need to make sure that we focus on the needs as well. So I guess for me, where I come from in terms of programming for infants is it will look completely different to how we program for older children, and it should look completely different. So I've worked with educators in the past who said, oh, I find it really difficult to program for babies because they don't have interests, and I feel like I'm just doing sleeping, eating, changing, and that sort of thing goes over and over again. Sleep, eat, change, comfort. Sleep, eat, change, comfort. Those sorts of things go over and over again. And I think that's why we need to focus on those as a really, really key part of our program. So we've also got attachment theory. So looking at the importance of infants developing a relationship with at least one primary caregiver. So in the UK, the primary caregiver model is quite a favoured model of care, particularly we're working with infants. They really put a lot of emphasis on building that, at least one key relationship. Now, I know in Australia, sometimes I've been in services where they've said, we don't like to build that one key relationship because what happens if that person's away? My perspective on that is if that person's away, we have one rough day. And we have one rough day. It's hard. I was that person for a number of children, but one little boy in particular, I was his primary caregiver. We had a really, really close bond. And yes, when I went away or I had a day off, it was really difficult for him. But on the other 150 days, it made his life so much easier. He had that really secure connection, that really strong sense of belonging. So I think we need to think in a big sense rather than, it's going to make it hard for one day. Then, do we want it to be hard every day because they don't have that attachment? We can also refer to Bronfenbrenner and the systems of influence. So looking at how the child is influenced by external factors, environments and relationships. So the child that we have in front of us, while they might be new and in some cases they might be, 6 weeks old or 6 months old, they're highly, highly, highly influenced by the whole world around them, their space within our service, their family, their extended family, their community, their culture, their religion, all of these sorts of things help to impact on that child. And I think they're things that we need to be aware of. Milestones. So being aware of milestones, it's really important to have an awareness of them. Do we need to do checklists all the time? Is this child meeting this milestone? This is just a really simple example of a fact sheet around milestones. Gives you a great indication of, key things that are happening at key times. Doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case. And I think that's why I've put the second part, it's more about the journey and the progression than the age that it actually happens. So for some children, they will get to certain milestones much quicker and then that might plateau out. Other children might be slower to get to those milestones and then they have a bit of a spurt and they speed up. Where milestones can be important is when they help us to identify that there might be cause for concern or there might be a way that we can support a child. Milestones are also really helpful in when we're planning our spaces for babies. So if I've got a room full of infants that are around kind of 7 to 8 months, then I know that those infants are, starting to get around. They're starting to creep and crawl around. They're starting to drag themselves or whatever. So I want to set up my environment responsive to that. So I want to set up things like I might put a tunnel in the room. And I've done that not because these children are interested in tunnels, but because I know that developmentally that's the age they're at and that's going to support that development. All right, so the program. So in order for us to engage children actively in learning, educators need to identify children's strengths and interests, choose appropriate teaching strategies, and design the learning environment. And that's from the EYLF. So I just want to break that down a little bit. So this first one is identifying children's strengths and interests. What might be challenging about that when we're working with infants? Again, if you're comfortable unmuting yourself, you can do that. Otherwise, you can just comment in the chat box. But what do you think might be a challenge when we're working with infants? How might it be challenging to identify their strengths and interests? Okay. Communication, absolutely. So when we're working with, say, preschool children, 4-year-old Sally comes in and wants to tell you all about dinosaurs because she knows everything that there is to know about pterodactyls, and so she wants to tell you every fact that she needs to know, or that she does know and wants you to know. She also will tell you that she needs a book to be able to find out more about dinosaurs. She will tell you that she wants to have dinosaurs added to the block area. So that communication is much easier with our older children, who can verbally explain to us what they need, what they want, what they're interested in. Learning routines, yep, so absolutely, routines can be really tricky. They don't have many interests. It's a common misconception, I suppose, that they don't have interests. They don't have interests. Infants don't have interests in the same sense as older children. So while older children can identify, say, a topic that they're interested in, or a particular type of play that they're interested in, infants don't do that. However, they do have interests, which we'll talk about shortly, in terms of, say, exploration. They are actually quite interested in exploring the world. They are interested in pulling all of the Tupperware containers out of the cupboard. They are interested in, there's a lot of different interests. They look really different to when we're working with our older children. So another comment, they wander around rather than connecting to the learning environments, for example, sitting and flipping through a book. Absolutely. So infants are far less likely to respond to a play space that we've set up and go and sit and play at that play space in a way that we've expected. It's very different to how older children will play. They do tend to kind of spend a lot of time exploring, and that exploration looks like, I'm going from here to there to there. I'm upending this basket as I go. I'm pushing this pram over here with, dolls in it, but then I'm tipping the dolls out. Then I'm going here. So there's lots of kind of coming and going, and very little of that, I suppose, attention span in terms of I'm going to sit and do X, Y, and Z. Another comment, they have interests, the same as we said, and a good point, some of them don't know how to play with toys. And I think that's a really interesting point, that often we put things out, and we even do it for older children. We put things out in a space, and we have a certain expectation of how that environment or plaything will be used. But we have to remember that infants, for some of them, have the amount of time that they've been on the planet can actually be, calculated in days rather than years. Like, it's such a short time frame. And so for a lot of infants, the first time they do something is absolutely the first time they do something. And so we see a lot of firsts in our infant spaces, and that comes down to firsts in terms of play as well. So while we might see milestone firsts, the first time they sit up, or the first time they walk, or, talk, or whatever, we also see some of those play firsts. So it's the first time they've played with blocks, or it's the first time they've experienced paint, and we're surprised then when they put it all over themselves instead of painting on an easel. Like, it's about exploration, and I don't know what this thing is. I don't know what to do with it, so I'm going to explore it, and I'm going to explore it in a sensory way. And we will talk about that more as we continue. All right, so the key to programming for babies, we kind of break it down into 3 sort of main areas. So the first one is inspiring, nurturing environments that allow for exploration and development. So often I visit, which is sad that it is that often, I visit services where, the environment in the older rooms, so the toddler rooms and the preschool rooms, are really engaging and really inspiring. And then I go into the infant space, and it can be quite uninspiring. Often there's a bunch of plastic toys on a rug, or there's a lounge and some books, but it's not really allowing for real exploration. And again, we're going to talk about how babies play and what that sort of exploration might look like. And then that feeds into how we set up our environments. When we have a really good understanding of how babies like to play, then I think we're better equipped to actually set up meaningful environments. So our environments form a really key part of our program. So our environments need to be relatively consistent so that children come to know what we have available, where it is, how to find things. Even as infants, they really need that consistency. And we want our environments, they don't need to be art galleries, and they don't need to be, you know, worthy of Instagram all the time, but they need to be engaging for infants. So we take what we know about infants, how they play, how they respond to their physical environment, and we use that to set up an environment that works for them. And that's indoors and outdoors. So often I visit outdoor spaces for infants and they're quite small and often flat and just synthetic grass, and usually a synthetic grass and a sandpit, and that tends to be about it, and a lot of toys that just get added afterwards. My issue with that is infants need to explore. They're sensory creatures, so they like to touch and taste and smell, and, you know, they really like to immerse themselves. And I've encountered services where they don't plant gardens because, well, the infants pull the flowers off or they take the leaves off the gardens. We need to plant things that are hardy and that will grow fast and that they can actually do that, because that's a really important part of their development. So the next part of our programming is documentation of everyday moments, relationships, development, and repeated patterns in play. That's a really big one, and we're going to talk a bit more about that as we go on. But essentially it's, you know, as I said before, those routine things, you know, that care routine actually is the program when it comes to working with infants. It forms a really huge part of the program. So eating, sleeping, comfort, changing, they're kind of your really 4 key things. So if they're going to take up a lot of our time, then how can we document those in meaningful ways that actually tell us something valuable about the child and about their development and their growth and their time in our service? How can we document the relationships? So relationships between children, maybe it's relationships with their parent, you know, maybe we document, I really love the idea of at the beginning of the year or beginning of a child starting, that we actually document over a period of time the greetings and the farewells with parents, because what a lovely way to capture the child's journey as they, you know, settle into care and have that relationship with their parent, you know, kind of tested or challenged in a way. I think it's a lovely thing to be able to document. And then we're also going to document things like development. So we will document milestones and, you know, just developmental stages. And then repeated patterns in play we're going to talk about shortly. So that's referring to the concept of schema. So we're going to talk about that a little too. Less focus on activities or experiences. So as I said before, with our older children, it's much easier to focus on the activities that we're doing and the experiences that we're doing. And I've been in services where the staff have said, I'm told I need to do an art experience every day for the infants and that they need to participate and I need to document it. That's not meaningful. We can provide art materials, we can provide those opportunities for children, but it's less about those activities and experiences, more on the relationships, the environment and the distance travelled. Okay, so heuristic play. If you're not familiar with the term, you might be already, which is great. Comes from the Greek word eurisko, which means I find or I discover. And it's essentially any sort of scientific inquiry starting at about 10 to 20 months, so our slightly older babies, and continuing throughout life. Heuristic play is rooted in young children's natural curiosity. So this fits in really well with the concept of schema, treasure baskets. It all kind of links together. But essentially what's happening with heuristic play is that we're giving children access to materials, open-ended materials, that they can explore. That's essentially what it is. It's an exploration and discovery of materials. So it goes back to, as I said before, you know, infants who love to pull all out of the kitchen cupboard. You know, and that used to keep my children amused for a good half an hour while I organised dinner. and, you know, stacking plastic cups or, you know, whatever. It's that exploration. And so you'll see in this image, the infant's got a variety of materials. So there's different textures, there's different shapes, there's things that might smell different, there's things that when they put them in their mouth will taste different. And if you are worried about things going in mouths, it's just having a simple process of being able to clean, you know, materials. It's really that simple. You cannot prevent babies from putting things in their mouth. So you need to be mindful about the sort of materials that you do provide and the age of the babies that you have. But ultimately, there will be infants who will mouth everything that you have available. So it's just about having a process, having supervision in place. So this is sort of a good example of heuristic play, but also of treasure baskets. And so the idea of a treasure basket is that it's a great way for infants who aren't particularly mobile. So, you know, like this little one here can sit up, but might not be crawling yet. And so there's a basket there with a whole bunch of things in it. So it gives them a lot of different choice. So it's a great way of children starting to make decisions about their play. You know, they're learning to choose, what do I want to play with? How do I want to play with it? There's no right or wrong way to play with it. So they can bang it, they can make noise, they can throw things, they can roll things, they can shake things, they can, you know, bang them together, they can put it on the floor. Like, it's really, really open-ended. And so it's the really early stages of loose parts play. As I say, if you've got questions at any time, feel free to pop them in the chat or to unmute yourself. So again, as I said, this links in really well with treasure baskets, offers children the opportunity to make choices and decisions, and it's really their first taste of freedom. Promotes the development of concentration. So like someone said before about infants, you know, tending to wander between things, this is actually a great way for infants to spend time focused because they're getting the choice of what they're focusing on. And it allows them to learn many abstract concepts. So it's things around texture and, you know, there's lots of different concepts that we can kind of explore. This is a really good example of a treasure basket because it offers a variety of colour. It offers different texture. It offers things that, you know, you can put into other things. It offers things from nature. So it's really great if you can have a mixture of items available for children, and they're really easy to set up. You know, you just kind of get a whole bunch of odd stuff, put it in a basket, make it available, and it's really easy to clean up because it all just goes back in the basket. So some of my favourite infant spaces I've visited have used a lot of treasure baskets, and they'll just have them in various parts of the room on a nice rug or, you know, with a cushion or whatever, and children can have that time to explore. All right, so what sort of things do babies like to do over and over again? So again, if you like to put it in the chat box, you can do that. What sort of things do you see babies doing over and over again? It's so quiet while people type and think. Okay, we've got a couple coming in. Running, yep, lapping the room, practicing their developing motor skills, throwing, banging, shaking, messy play, banging, running, yep, lots of things over and over, making noise. Perfect. A couple more. Oh, dancing, shaking, banging, flipping. All right. So this leads us beautifully into the concept of schema. So schema are repeated patterns of behaviour. So essentially, children's natural actions and investigative behaviour is not random. There is a pattern to each child's behaviour. Understanding schemas are useful for helping to understand a child's motivation for doing something. And from there, we can extend their learning. So I don't know if I put it on the next one. No, I didn't. That's okay. I couldn't remember if I had a few photos of that to show you, but I haven't. So, yep, perfect. Putting things in and taking them out of bags and baskets. That's a really great one when it comes to schema. So some of the basic schema that we have, and I'm not going into it too much because I'm conscious of the time that we have, Transportation. Transportation's a big one, particularly with our slightly older babies who are a bit more mobile. And so transportation often will look like I've put all of the dolls in the pram and I've taken them over to another part of the room and then dumped them out. I've put a whole bunch of things in a wheelbarrow and I'm pushing them around in the wheelbarrow. So transportation is essentially taking items from one place to another. And so children will love, particularly those slightly older babies, prams, wheelbarrows, bags, things that they can move items in. And so that's how we can then set up our environment. But we also need to be mindful of our response, I suppose, because sometimes when children are transporting, we will hear, take that back to there. The blocks belong over there. The blocks actually doesn't matter. We need to think about, does it matter? And yeah, sometimes it will matter where things go, but ultimately I think we need to watch how children are playing. Filling and emptying is a big one. We'll see that often in sand play. So children filling buckets, tipping them back out, filling buckets, tipping them back out. You put a water play space in, particularly as I say for your older babies, even from about sort of 9-10 months. You see that tipping, filling, emptying, and that's one of those things that will really, engage infants for a long time. So you want to make sure that your environment has lots of opportunities for children to fill and empty. And so they might be through sensory kind of materials, sand, water, rice, whatever you choose to use. But they need lots of vessels to be able to do that, things like funnels and buckets and shovels and things that they can fill empty. Baskets are another good one, particularly for indoors and outdoors. Baskets with handles are great because then children can carry them and fill them with things. Bags, so like op shops for old bags, handbags, anything like that. I used to say that my two daughters were the bag ladies because they would literally fill a few old play bags that we had at home with absolutely anything and everything. And so sometimes you'd find a bag somewhere in the house and think, my goodness, what is in this? And there'd be all sorts of things in there. I actually found I had been looking for a bangle of mine. It was a very sentimental piece of jewellery and it was missing for about 18 months. And my son found it recently and we discovered that my daughter, who'd been about sort of 18 months at the time, had posted my bangle into a particular storage box, but no one had ever realised it had gone in there and it had slipped down the front of it. And so posting's another really big one. We'll often see that with older babies and toddlers where they're wanting to put things through things. So we can have boxes with holes in them and things that they can post. I've seen infants who post the dolls, like the babies in home corner, into the top of the oven. That's always a nice one. You've also got, so you're throwing, someone mentioned before about throwing, that's known as trajectory. So throwing is a really big one. It's great for gross motor development as well, but it is an important part of children's play. So these schemas or these repeated patterns of behaviour are really important. And so if we can be on the lookout for them and then respond to them, we provide, we don't necessarily want our infants throwing blocks across the room. That's not ideal. Someone's going to get hit on the head. Okay, they want to throw. How do we provide things in our environment that respond to that natural way of exploring the world? So we provide bean bags and we provide balls and we provide baskets that they can throw things into, or we provide, a big target that they can throw things at. But we just need to find ways to enable them to explore that schema, that type of play, in a way that's not going to be detrimental to our environment or to other children in the space. So schema, we've got on our website, I'll send you some links after the session, just so that you've kind of got a bit of, what we did. And we've actually got a set of cards that we stock on our website that explore some of the schema, not all of them, because there's a really long list, but we've got a set of cards that explore some of them in a bit more depth and give you some ideas for how you can facilitate that. So I'll give you the link to those as well. So with our environment, we need to keep our environment simple and responsive to how infants play. So you'll see this environment up in the top corner. This is a beautiful centre, our play school up at Nelson Bay in New South Wales. They are birth to 2 service. And when I was visiting one day, I noticed this little space set up, and this was one of the most popular spaces for the infants to play. You know, they spent a lot of time there exploring, mainly because it's really simple. You know, it's really, really simple. So they banged the lids, they rolled them on the floor, they filled the bucket of the colander and then they tipped it out again. They filled it and they tipped it out again, and they made a noise when they tipped them out. They stacked them. They stacked all the lids on top of each other. They stacked the lids on top of the cushion. They put them under the cushion. Really, really simple, but responsive to the way that infants play. So responsive to that really investigative, exploratory kind of sensory play. So it's not, I'm probably going to get myself in trouble one day with Fisher Price, but I'm not a fan of the press this button and this happens, cause and effect type of toys that are manufactured and marketed for families for infants, because for most of them, there's one way to play. And then once you master that, and you'll find that happens in a lot of infant spaces, once infants have mastered a particular toy, they move on from it really quickly because I've done what I can do with that. Or they use it in an inappropriate way, like throwing the toy phone or, you know, whatever, because it's not, you know, they're no longer interested in the way that it's designed to be played. So again, outdoor spaces are really important too. So this is also at our place. I don't know if you can really tell, but down in the bottom corner of this bench, there's a little arched doorway. So that actually opens up and you can crawl through that. So this was designed, Tash, my other half of Inspire DC, actually designed this playground with them. And it was designed so that they can open that little hidey hole and infants can crawl through it. There's also a gate so they can go through another way. There's also another entry around the side so they can go through a different way as well. There's lots of options. You'll see at the back there's a mirror. There's a handle on the mirror so they can actually pull themselves up to stand. You'll notice the boxes are low so they can pull themselves up to stand or cruise around the boxes. There's lots of plants. There's lots of greenery, things that it doesn't matter if they pull the plant out or they pull a leaf off or whatever. But I think being responsive to that is important. So there's another example of a really simple play space. We've got some babies, we've got some baskets, some odds and ends. I think we can get really worried about only having flat spaces, you know, to keep infants safe. Infants actually really need to be able to experience different surfaces, different planes and levels. It's really important for their balance and the development of the muscles in the feet. And where possible, this is a complete side note, but where possible, allowing infants to be barefoot is really, really important for that development too. All right, so observation. Observation is a process of collecting and telling the stories of the remarkable experiences of childhood. Observations include oral, written, visual stories of children's learning and evolving life. So when we're observing what's happening in our service, in our space, I always like to think about the parent perspective. So, and perhaps I didn't become as aware of this until I became a parent myself, but what does a parent want to know about their child's time in care? And for a lot of people who have infants in care, it can be a really difficult thing to leave a child that young. And particularly for some who are starting at, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks of age, that can be really challenging. So what do I want to know as a parent about my child's day in care? I don't really want a list of outcomes that they met and achieved. And, I don't want a tick list. I want stories and visuals that show me that the people who are caring for them actually care for them and know them and are engaged with them. So they're the sorts of things that I look for in terms of observation. I think when we're observing, we really need to think about in not trying to make learning happen. I think that's a big thing with our program, is we're often trying to make learning happen, but we just need to observe what is happening. And particularly with our infants, just seeing what is actually happening. How are they exploring the environment? How are they relating to the people in the environment? How are we building, different skills? We're not set out on what learning can I make happen today. So like I said before, with the art experience, we know we need to have an art experience every day so that children learn this, this, and this. It's not about setting out to make learning happen. Let's observe what's happening first. So when we're observing, value the ordinary moments. So there's really basic things. It might be even the child who is learning to spoon feed themselves. They're just learning to feed themselves. Great, let's document that. If it's the first time they're using a spoon in the service, let's document that. And maybe we document it over a couple of weeks. And so we can show a journey of, learning to use a spoon to feed themselves. Really ordinary, but actually a really nice developmental story that shows their time and their progress in our care. See play through the children's eyes, listen and observe many sequences of play in order to see the whole child or the whole scenario. Observing the same thing over and over again isn't a bad thing. Sometimes we get caught up in needing to observe lots of different things, but sometimes it's nice when children are repeating play, and particularly when we're looking at schema, you're going to see a lot of repetitiveness in the play. Then observe that over a period of time. If they're exploring throwing, like trajectory, if they're exploring that over, a month or 2 months or 3 months, great, let's keep documenting that. And let's talk about how it changes, how it evolves, the little differences that we notice. See yourself as a researcher. So what are you learning about this child or about play and development? That's probably one of my favourite things about observing children, is actually learning something about how they're thinking, how they're working, how they're relating to others, why they're choosing to do things in certain ways. And it doesn't mean you always end up with an answer. Sometimes you end up with more questions than answers, but I think that makes it really interesting, particularly for us. And then using your observations to plan. So there's no sense kind of planning because we think we need to have X, Y, and Z in the space. We actually need to go off what we're observing, how we're seeing children use the space. We want to focus, so when it comes to planning, we want to focus on exploration of the environment and relationships rather than activities and provocations. So as I said before, it's less about how we provide a particular, so say in our preschool room, we might provide an interest area on dinosaurs, and we've got books and we've got, blah, 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 blah. In our infant space, it's more about our general environment, how we enable children to explore that whole environment and the relationships as well, that development of relationships. So this is a really brief example of a weekly plan for an infant space. So my planning, generally, when I plan in a service, my planning often starts out quite blank. I have a consistent environment. So my environment will always have books. So I don't need to plan for books because my environment's always got books. My environment might always have blocks. And so I'm not going to plan, I need to add blocks because I always have blocks. What I will do, though, is talk about the things that we're going to add to the environment or that we're going to change in the environment, or the things that I'm going to do differently, or the support that I might give to children as an addition to what we always offer. And you'll see that down the bottom here. There's kind of a preface, I suppose, or a disclaimer. Our environment is consistently set up with play spaces that support development and discovery. We add or remove resources and experiences based on our observations of play, input from families, and the knowledge and understanding of our educators in relation to the EYLF. So sometimes we'll add things because we know that our children are of a certain age or, whatever. So you'll see this top one, we've broken it into two sections. So we've got development. So in this section, we've got that we're adding the tunnel outdoors. And our reasoning for this is that many of the children are starting to learn to crawl, and this may support that to continue. And that's an E because that's an educator input. So that's something that's come directly from our educators. We've also got that we're adding a basket of bracelets to the indoor environment. We're supporting schematic play in terms of rotation and circularity. So that's one of those schema. Again, that's educator input. Over on our discovery side, we've got that we're adding dolls and prams to the indoor environment. Now, the reason for that is that Olivia has a new niece and has been gravitating to dolls at home. And that's family input. Then, so the family's told us that. We're going to add that to the program to support that play. Adding beanbags to the outdoor environment. See observation on the 5th and the 6th, children throwing balls. Great. So that's directly from an observation. So that's our plan. Now, it might have more on it. There might be a lot. As I said, this is a really, really simple view, but essentially we're still going to do all the same things that we normally do. We're still going to have our environment available in the same way that we have our environment. It's just our additions that we're going to make to that environment based on our observations, our family input, and what our educators are seeing and knowing about the children in the group. So that's really, really simple. All right, so our documentation needs to focus on the journey of the whole child. So we want to see that journey over time. You know, as we saw before in the very beginning with that brain image, what changes from birth to 2 is enormous. So let's focus on some of those changes in that journey over time. So in our infant spaces, some of those infants will be with us for a couple of months, or they might be with us for a year or even 2 years in a birth to 2 space. So we want to look for the wow moments that are relevant to the baby, but also value the everyday. So those wow moments might be things like taking first steps. Now, that's a really tricky one for some educators. Some educators are reluctant to document firsts that happen in our care for fear of upsetting families, that they might have missed it. That's a conversation you really need to have with each family, is if your child has a first while they're in our service, do you want us to talk to you about it? Do you want us to tell you? Do you want us to document it? Some families will say yes, absolutely. Other families would prefer to think that it didn't happen at the service and wait for it to happen at home. So I think it's a really important conversation that you need to have with each family. So there's some of those wow moments, you know, taking first steps, saying first words, you know, bigger kind of things, I suppose. But also valuing the everyday. So as I said before, maybe learning to feed themselves, or how they wave goodbye in the morning, or, you know, those really simple things. And then we want to also document things like relationships. So as I said before, it might be relationships with other children, you know, how they're developing relationships with other children in care, or how they're developing relationships with educators. And for that one, you might need to, if you're that child's primary caregiver, or you're that person that has that real connection to them, you might get somebody else, another educator, to document that for you. You know, they might take some photos for you, or take a video, or whatever, but something to document those relationships. As I said before, you might document the relationships with family, because that can be really important as well. Growth, you know, so we might actually look at physical growth, but also just growth in terms of their well-being and their time in the service, how they, you know, function in the service. And that emerging independence is a really lovely thing to be able to document as well. So we're less about documenting the activity that the child did, although you might see that, you know, you might see them exploring. We put the beanbags out, and yes, they started throwing the beanbags, and so they're exploring that trajectory schema. So you might document that. But it's less about that, and it's more about the care and the whole experience of the child. So some different types of documentation. Visuals, that might be photographs or videos. Videos can be a tricky one depending on how you do your documentation for families. Learning stories are a really great way of kind of putting a bit of heart and soul into them. I do recommend, if you are not familiar or overly familiar with learning stories, we've got a couple of books on our website by Margaret Carr and Wendy Lee, and they really go into what learning stories are all about. So I'll put the links to those as well. Jottings are great for infants. So you might be just collecting little bits over time. And so it might be that you just keep them on Post-its for a while, and you stick them inside a book or whatever, and come 3 months later, you actually build a really clear story of their progress over time. You know, it might have been learning to walk, or it might have been, you know, how they settle into the service or how they play in a particular space or whatever. But, you know, just those really, and they only have to be, you know, 1 or 2 sentences with the date on them. And then by the time you've kind of got a collection of them, you start to put together a real picture that can then tell a story, and you might turn that into something else. But it's a really simple way of collecting information. And anecdotes and running records, just really basic kind of observations that you can then document. If you're going to put documentation on the walls, and this is a great example of that, which I think it's lovely if you do, make sure it's meaningful. So it's not just about slapping up their painting, their finger painting that they did on the wall with a piece of blue tack and walking away. We want to make it so that, you know, we know who did it, why they did it, when they did it, how they explored it. So I've seen some beautiful ones in infant spaces where they've got photos of the children actually engaged in the experience, then they've got their artwork, then they might have a little story about it. Make it meaningful if you're going to stick stuff up on the walls. Make sure that it's not just art. It's really easy to document children's artworks because it's a physical thing that, you know, brightens up space, and we can kind of, you know, stick it up really easily. But we want to make sure that we respect children who actually don't engage in a lot of those art experiences, and there's a lot more that we can share. When it comes to infants, I think it's really important that there's lots of photos in the space, photos of the infants in the space, photos of the infants with educators, photos of infants with families. You know, we often talk about creating that sense of belonging. Then, you know, there is nothing better for infants and toddlers than seeing themselves. You know, that's me and that's me with, you know, someone. And even if they can't verbalise that, there's that recognition of that really quite early. Involve the children. So if possible, get children involved in where you're putting things. And again, being mindful of where it's displayed. So if you're going to document what's happening in your space, then who is that for? Is it for the parents? Then it can be up at eye level. If you want the children to actually, you know, interact with that and to see the photos, then you actually need it down at a height where they can do that. And then you need to sometimes be creative about how you do that because they can end up off the walls pretty easily. But I think it's just about being mindful of who it's for. All right, I'll see if this will cooperate. So I've got a video for you to watch, and I want you to just think about what you see and what you hear. I'm hoping it'll function. And then think about how you would document what you see and how you'd make it visible to families. So let's see if this will do the job. I'm optimistic, but we all know technology. Yesterday it was very temperamental. Oh, I clicked away from it. I'll just give it a second. Oh, please be nice. I'm just going to see if it'll. It's not cooperating. Just going to try something very quickly. Let's see if I can get it to work. Oh, it's not cooperating. All right, well, we're running low on time anyway, so I might send you a link to the video because it's actually, I think, on our YouTube channel. So I can send you a link to it with some reflective questions so you can kind of have a little bit of a look at it yourself and just see how you might document it. So moving forward, what we really want to be doing when we're programming for our infants, we want to build relationships. So first and foremost, we're building those really strong relationships with infants. If they don't feel comfortable and confident in their space, they're less likely to explore their space and to really reach that sort of full potential. Again, it's that going back to Maslow kind of stuff. You know, they need to feel secure, they need to feel safe, they need to feel loved, they need to feel nurtured, they need to have been fed. You know, the infant that's hungry or that's tired is not going to explore. you know, they're not off engaging in our program. So we want to really focus on that first. We're going to look for those magical moments, you know, the things that make us kind of go, oh, that's beautiful, you know, and maybe they are the first steps, or maybe they are the exploration with a different type of material, or the relationship with a family member, or the relationship with an educator or another child, or the way in which they explore a particular part of the environment. Look for those magical little moments. And keep it simple, you know, don't overthink it. I think sometimes we get really carried away with thinking that our program needs to be this really big thing, and we need to have, I know when I first started in early education and care, it was very much a box system, and, you know, we had boxes of the cognitive stuff and the art stuff and the construction and the gross motor and the fine motor, and we really had to have something in all the boxes. And then there was an expectation that those things actually happened, and that the chaos of the day didn't overtake those things. And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves for our program to be this big, huge thing. And it actually needs to be quite simple when it comes to infants. You know, it's like our job is, you know, keeping them fed, keeping them alive, keeping them content, keeping them clean, keeping them, you know, whatever. But it's less about that kind of, you know, turning them into baby Einsteins. You know, they don't all need to be able to do the flashcards. It's that simple play, simple exploration, really going back to those basics about what we know about babies and how they learn, how they engage with the world. So really keeping it very straightforward. So documenting the learning and development of babies should be meaningful and personal to that baby and their family, not a checklist. So it's less about wanting to kind of tick off boxes and say, yes, we did this. Yes, this infant can now do that. Yes, they can now do that. It really needs to, and that's just documentation in general for all children. It should be meaningful and personal. But I think it's even somewhat more crucial when it comes to infants, because they can't go home and tell their family, this is what I did today, this is how I played. They can't do any of that. So we really want it to be meaningful and valuable for the families, so that they can understand, you know, how their child is engaging in the space, how connected they are to the adults that are in the space, yeah, all that kind of stuff. So that was a very, lots of information in there. Hopefully you've taken something from it. As I say, I will send you an email with some links and some information that might be helpful. There's also a reflective sheet. I'll send you a link to a feedback form so that we know how the session went. You can let us know what you'd like to see other sessions on, or if there's anything that we can do to make the sessions more functional for you. If you've got any questions, I'll be here. You can put them in the chat box or just ask me. We'll also organise your certificates and stuff after that as well. They'll usually be linked to the feedback form. So once you've filled in the feedback form, then you'll get a certificate sent through as well. So that'll come through in the next couple of days. So don't stress if you haven't got it in an hour. It might take a few days just for that all to come through. And I'll also send you that link to the video as well, because it's a really great little video just for, I just wish it would have played, because really frustrating. But it is a great little video for seeing how infants can play with something really quite simple. And there can be so much going on when we just slow down and look at what's happening. So I will leave it at that. We've right on 11 o'clock. We've done really well. There we go. Someone just said, well, we'll get our certificate in our emails. Perfect. I probably answered the question just as you were sending the question. So yeah, you will get a link to that as well. So your certificate will come through. If you've got any questions afterwards, feel free to send me an email. My email address is there. Other than that, I will let you get back to your day with children for those of you that are in services, and hopefully see you on another Zoom soon. Thanks, everyone.